Welcome to Music Mark's Ofsted seminar with the HMI for Music, Chris Stevens. I'll hand over to Chris shortly, but before I do, and whilst we wait for others to join us, I'll go through a bit of housekeeping and a few notices from Music Mark. My name is Bridget White, and I'm the CEO of Music Mark. I'm a 50-something white woman with glasses and brown hair. I'm wearing a black jumper, and behind me is a Music Mark banner and some messy bookshelves. I'm joined by a few of the Music Mark team who are helping to ensure this webinar runs smoothly behind the scenes. Just a little reminder of who is Music Mark. We are a membership organisation and subject association, supporting those who work in music education across the UK. Our membership includes all the Music Education Hub leads and many of their partners across England, plus many of the music services across the rest of the UK. We also have a growing membership of music education organisations such as the National Youth Ensembles, orchestras, opera companies and venues. And then there are our individual members too. As well as our membership, we have many industry partners who work with us to support the sector, and music services can invite schools they work with to become Music Mark schools, who we connect with through newsletters. And I know we have quite a few Music Mark schools in the Zoom today. Great to have you with us. Music Mark is here to support you, help you connect across the network, and we work at a regional and national level, talking to the UK government and other key organisations to influence policy and practice through advocacy. And talking of advocacy, just to remind you all that there are lots of great resources on our website which might be useful in supporting your own work championing music in your school or the schools you work in. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks for the warm welcome. And as always, thank you for the invite to come back and talk to you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's, as I say, lovely to be back here speaking with Music Mark. What I'm going to cover today, the last session we had where I was talking to you about assessment in music, at the end of the session, there was quite a lot of interest in people saying, Chris, would you come back and talk to us about what happens in a deep dive? What is a deep dive? What happens? So this session today is very practical, if you like. It's a very sort of practical session on what would happen in a deep dive. Before we do that and I delve into deep dive, I'm going to explain a little bit at the start of the presentation about our overall inspection methodology, how deep dives fit into that methodology. And then what I'm going to finish the presentation with is saying, okay, within a deep dive, what are the activities and what are the sorts of things that inspectors will want to find out and talk about with you? So that's the sort of broad session. Thanks, Rosie. Next slide, please. So our aims today then are to provide an overview of Ofsted's approach to evaluating the quality of education, and then for you really to enable you to build on that understanding of what a deep dive in music is. A couple of really important points to start with. This is an evaluation when we inspect schools of the quality of education overall. We don't carry out individual subject inspections. I know you've heard me say that before, but we don't carry out individual subject inspections. What we do is we evaluate the quality of education across the school. And this evaluation is arrived at through a methodology that is based on research, including work with schools. The second point I just want to make here is that the information that I'm drawing on today comes straight from our inspection handbook. It's the school's inspection handbook that inspectors use on inspection. So if you want to get a copy of that document, it's available freely online, and the information I'm drawing on today draws from that. Throughout the presentation, I will reference certain paragraphs in that document so that you can go back and read it. So I might say, for example, this is referred to at paragraph 22, and they're clearly linked in the handbook. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. Of course, inspectors use other documents such as the document inspecting safeguarding, but the main thrust of our work is through the school inspection handbook, and I would encourage you, if you haven't, to have a look at those. So next slide, please. So just before we start thinking about the overall kind of methodology involved in inspections, just some points of clarity really about what we do and what we don't do. There's a few little myths that I just want to get out of the way to start with. The first thing is about whether inspectors grade lessons. Well, they don't grade individual lessons. That doesn't happen. The second point here is whether inspectors want to see lesson plans. And we don't. We don't want to see lesson plans. That's not something we ask for. Another question I'm often asked is, Chris, will inspectors use work scrutiny in the case of music, perhaps looking at children's books if they have them, or perhaps listening to recordings, or perhaps video recordings of pupils? Will they use those to evaluate how good teachers' marking is? No, we will not do that. We don't evaluate teachers' marking through work scrutiny. Will we expect schools to provide us evidence of remote learning where that's been happening? No, we will not ask schools to do that. And finally, will inspectors want to understand the strengths and weaknesses within your curriculum? Yes, that's something we would want to know, but we don't specify the way that you give us that information. That could well be through a discussion. Now, just a couple of points on that. If we go on to the next slide. Paragraph 22 of the handbook makes these things clear about what we do and what we don't do. So as I've said, we will not require schools to provide evidence from inspection that's not set out in the handbook. So you can see that and read it for yourself. We don't expect evidence in any specific format, as long as it's easily accessible to inspectors. One you've heard about me talk about before, really important in music, is we do not expect, and this is in the handbook, written evidence of oral feedback to pupils. So in that music lesson, where you may be giving minute by minute feedback to pupils about the quality of their performances or their compositions, we do not expect schools to have written evidence of that or to share that with us for the reasons I've set out before. We don't expect schools to provide predictions of attainment and progress scores. That's a really important one. Inspectors will not be saying when they visit, show us your progress scores, show us your predictions of attainment. We will not be asking for that information. And we will also not be asking for performance and pupil tracking information. So we won't say, show me how you're tracking these pupils' progress and show me. That's not something we ask for. Now, later on, what I will talk to you about is how you might go about demonstrating or wanting to demonstrate that your curriculum's making a difference, that children are learning your curriculum, they're becoming more musical. But that's not to be confused with us asking you for tracking information or figures in a spreadsheet. That we certainly will not be asking for. And then just to clarify, we will not advocate a particular method of planning or expect to see it. We won't grade individual lessons. We will not require schools to provide individual lesson plans or previous lesson plans. We will not use work scrutiny, as I've said, to evaluate teachers' marking. Really important in music as well, key point here, we do not specify the frequency, type, or volume of marking and feedback. And we do not require schools to ensure a particular frequency or quantity of work in pupils' workbooks or folders. And in music, again, important to say, if you've got books in your music lessons, some schools might have because of their curriculum, fine, but Ofsted doesn't expect to see that, and we don't expect a particular frequency or quantity of work in those books. So those are some sort of myths, if you like, that best to get out of the way. And as I said, you can go to the handbook, it's paragraphs 22, and those things are listed there. So if we go on to the next slide, what we're going to be talking about now is actually the inspection methodology. How does inspection work? And then we'll feed into this idea of where do deep dives fit into that. So our inspection methodology. And we're thinking here about the quality of education. So our framework, the idea is that it puts a single, and I'm going to emphasize this word and I'll come back to it through the presentation, joined up conversation about education at the heart of inspection. And we use a three-part methodology to inspect schools, a little bit more on that in a minute. Through this methodology, which I'm going to talk to you about, we build a view of the quality of education, behavior, personal development, and leadership and management. As lead inspectors, when we come into your school, we will want to understand from you when we talk to you in music about your vision, your music department, We'll want to find out about the approaches you've taken towards your curriculum and why it's like that in your particular school. And I think it's really important to say we expect to see commonalities and differences across the different types of music departments we visit. For example, if we visit a special school, that curriculum might look completely different within your context to a curriculum in another school. We expect to see commonalities and differences. So on the next slide, what I set out is this three-part methodology. What actually happens before we even get to a deep dive? And I think this is important to understand this because I've had questions about it in the past about how deep dives are chosen and what happens. So inspectors will carry out preparation for inspection before they come to the school off-site pre-inspection information. And if your school has a website, the lead inspector will look at this. They'll also look at other information which is outlined in our handbook. It's listed, all the things that inspectors will do. And that pre-inspection preparation helps the inspector, the lead inspector, gain an understanding of the context of your school and might help them form some initial questions that they might want to explore. This is at a whole school level. It's not a particular department level at this stage. This is thinking about the whole school. We call that the top level view. When they come onto site, and then that follows a phone discussion with the school leader. And that school leader on that phone discussion will talk about those aspects in a little bit more detail. And it's at that point that the inspectors and the head teacher will agree or will talk about the subjects that will form part of the deep dive. When inspectors come onto site, they'll collect and they'll connect evidence from each of the judgment areas, that's things like behaviour, quality of education, through the on-site inspection. And then towards the end of each day, inspectors will bring all their evidence together to draw conclusions that will inform their final judgments. So they're collecting and connecting evidence along the way. So we've got this pre-inspection work, a conversation with the head teacher, which sets out the curriculum, the big picture, what's the school about, what's it trying to achieve. We then visit the school to see that curriculum in action. And then towards the end of the process, we draw that all together. Next slide, thank you. What will inspectors actually focus on? And this is starting now to move into the territory of deep dive. Well, inspectors will focus on what our inspection experience and our research shows are the most important factors to consider, and they are listed in our school inspection handbook again. These factors are, I think I've missed the paragraph off here, but I'll double check that and I'll get that to you. But there's a paragraph in the handbook that sets out these important factors. Next slide, please. So let's turn to the deep dive. So let's just think about where we've got to. The inspector has done some inspection preparation. They're starting to form an initial view of the large scale view of the curriculum in the school, what the school is like, its context, and its curriculum. Let's say, for example, on this phone call, the head teacher and the lead inspector have decided that they are going to be doing a deep dive in music, and that's where we're going to focus this part of the presentation on. So what is, first of all, a curriculum deep dive? Now, you'll see the diagram there. For good reason, the diagram has got these parts joined together because I really want to stress to you that these activities are not separate activities. They're part of a joined up conversation, and I'm using the word conversation for a reason, about the music curriculum in your school. So, as I've said, we're not inspecting the subject itself, but research shows us that looking at the quality of education across a number of subjects, so let's say in this school music's been deep dived, but there's likely to be 4 to 6 others. Looking at this number of subjects helps us to form a valid and a reliable conclusion about the overall quality of education in the school. And remember, that's what we're judging. We do this through considering the emerging strengths and weaknesses in a range of subjects. So a deep dive consists of 6 connected elements, as shown in this slide. Inspectors use these activities to build a picture about the quality of education, in this case in music. They then step back and consider the strengths and weaknesses from a number of deep dives in order to establish a view about the quality of education as a whole. So another way of saying this is inspectors are sampling the curriculum by visiting 4 to 6 curriculum areas. So what we're going to do, and I think this is the thing people said, what would happen in a deep dive in music, Chris? What's sort of the nuts and bolts of it? And I'm going to turn to that now, start to talk to you about what happens in each of these joined up parts. So there's 6 of them. There's a discussion with senior leaders or the head teacher, and that's the discussion that's happened on the phone call. That's the very high level discussion. Won't be any detail about the music curriculum at that stage, but it might be to say, look, we've got a really strong music department in our school. We're really proud of it, etc., etc. They've come to a decision then as a group that they're going to deep dive music. So that's the discussion with senior leader, very, very high level. Then we move into the discussion with curriculum leaders. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, what happens there. So that's your discussion with your music lead or the teacher responsible for music. And a little note about this. What we will want to do is find out about your music curriculum. Who we speak to, we don't have a view about that. Who's the best person in your school to talk to us about the music curriculum? And we realise that people may well be nervous. And if they want a senior leader with them, or they want somebody else to join them for that conversation, that is absolutely fine. So what I'm saying to you is just because we're having a discussion with the curriculum about music does not automatically mean it has to just be the music teacher or just be the head of music. It can be whoever's best placed or who are ever best placed to talk to us about the curriculum, and a little bit more about what we want to find out in that discussion later on. We will visit some lessons as part of this deep dive. Typically 3 to 4, if there's that many available on the day. We will look at some work scrutiny and a little bit more about that in a minute, because music is different here, and I'll talk to you about that. Discussions with teachers, music teachers, teachers teaching music, and a discussion with a group of pupils from the lessons that we have visited. So that will be part of the different activities that are involved in the deep dive, and we're going to look at those in a little more detail now. So if we could go on to the next slide. So this slide attempts to show the connection or the links between things a little more clearly. So deep dives start with that educationally focused conversation with leaders on the day before the inspection begins, and this conversation is used to establish the top level view about the quality of the education and to identify which subjects we're going to deep dive in. So let's move on to part 2, this discussion about the curriculum content, the curriculum discussions. So as early as possible during the inspection, we'll want to meet with relevant leaders to discuss the content and sequencing within music. We want to find out about what leaders, what you intend that pupils will learn in music in your school at that time. Now, in previous webinars I've given, I hope I've really stressed the point to you. This is about a discussion with an inspector about your curriculum, what it is you want children to learn in your music curriculum. And that may well look very different to the music curriculum down the road, and that is fine. We have a national curriculum that sets out a basic minimum expectation, but the actual endpoints, the things you want children to do in your school, will differ. And this is your chance to tell us about that. Now, I want to say at this point, because it's really important while you're having these discussions, that if an inspector asks you a question that you're not sure of or you don't understand, it's perfectly okay to say, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean there, or what do you mean by that term? Because of course, the thing with education is we all use language, sometimes technical language, that can mean different things to different people. So it's perfectly okay to say, could you explain that again? What do you mean? This is part of the inspector finding out in a conversation about what it is you want children in your school to learn. This discussion will go beyond themes or topics or styles or genres. Inspectors will want to know what it is you want pupils to be able to learn and when they will learn it. So when I've previously given webinars, it might be, for example, and again, this is an example, I'm not saying this is what Ofsted are looking for, but you might say, Chris, when you come into our department, at the end of Key Stage 3, what we want our children to do is they're going to build some real competence on playing the keyboard. They're going to be able to play by the end of year 9, this repertoire of pieces using right hand in a simple hand position with some single fingered chords, and they're going to be able to play these pieces to this standard. That's what we want part our curriculum. Let us show you how we go about doing that. In another school, they may say, Chris, what we really do here is we want children to build competence in singing as part of our curriculum. And by the end of the curriculum, we want our children to be able to sing this repertoire, to be able to sing in 3 parts with expression. Let us show you how we get them there. So that will look different, but that's you telling us what is it you want pupils to know and when they will learn it. Now, I think another note to say here, particularly for primary school teachers, is we'll understand if the subject isn't an area of specialism for the teacher or the leader who's having that conversation. What matters most is that you're able to tell us what you want your pupils to learn and why. We also have no view, as I've said, about who might lead a subject. We want to meet with whoever is best placed to talk to us about what's in your curriculum in music and what you want pupils to learn. By meeting with relevant leaders before completing any of the other deep dive activities, ideally wherever possible, this helps us to gain an understanding of what it is you intend your children to learn. What are the endpoints? What are the key musical ideas that you want children to understand? And it helps us understand why you've put things in a certain order, in a certain way, and why you've identified those little chunks you want children to learn, so that we can connect the other activities back to this. So what do I mean? So if you say to us, Chris, in our curriculum, we want children by the end to be competent on the keyboard. In order to do that, this term, they're having to learn X. We need them to secure this knowledge. So we're teaching them this at the moment because it's really important they can do that before they go on to Y. That's why we've put it in that order. You are telling us the story of your curriculum. Then, throughout the first day of the inspection, typically an inspection's 2 days, we will carry out other deep dive activities after we've had that discussion. We'll visit lessons, we'll have a discussion with teachers, discussions with pupils, and work scrutiny. Now, this connected idea is really important here again, because the lessons that we visit, we'll talk to you about those. Which lessons can we see this curriculum in action? What's happening in the lessons we'll see today? The teachers we talk with will be the teachers of the lessons that we visited, so it's not random. And we'll also talk with pupils from the lessons that we visited. Again, it's connected. It's not a random selection of pupils. And any work that we look at, more on that later, whether that's recordings, workbooks if they exist, they will be related to the children that we've seen in the lesson visits, all connected. These other elements can happen in any order. Sometimes 2 or more elements might happen as part of the same activity. So what do I mean by that? Well, we might talk to pupils when visiting lessons. So we might do that together. We might look at pupils' work, or for example, hear some of their work with the pupils, or while talking to the teachers. Remember, the lesson visits during a deep dive are not there to judge teaching. They're there to look at whether the curriculum that you've set out, how that's being implemented. We do not look at teaching separately from the curriculum. Teaching is a means of delivering the curriculum, and that is what we want to look at. The curriculum, if you like, in action. You told us that the children would be learning this at the moment because they need it for the next stage of their learning. Let's go and see that in action. Of course, we will invite you or school leaders to join us on those lesson visits if you want to, and that can be whoever the school wishes, a curriculum leader, head of department, or a head teacher. So one deep dive is not enough to clearly identify the extent or significance of any emerging strengths or weaknesses in a school's curriculum. And that's why we deep dive several subjects on the inspection. However, research has shown us that by doing a number of deep dives, typically 4 to 6, this gives us sufficient evidence to make valid and reliable judgments about the quality of education as a whole. So let's move on to the next slide, where I'm now going to go into a little bit more detail. So I'm a head of music, and I'm thinking about what sort of things now are going to happen in these activities. What sort of questions or what sort of themes might the inspector to explore? So if we go on to the next slide, Rosie, please, thank you. So I've stressed to you that deep dive activities will be connected. They're not random. The children we talk to are the children we've seen in the lessons. The work that we look at or the recordings are related to the classes we've talked to. It's really important to our inspection methodology that things are connected. Next slide, please. Thank you, Rosie. So here we go. What happens in the meeting with subject leaders? So we've had that top level conversation with the head teacher. We've decided we're going to deep dive in music, and an inspector is going to come along and talk to whoever is most appropriate to talk to them about the music curriculum. In this case, it's the subject leader. So we will want to talk to subject leaders to understand the following things. So sometimes people say to me, Chris, is there a list of questions that inspectors have got that they ask the same questions? No, because inspection is about asking questions, finding out, but there are themes that we want to explore. There are things that we want to find out about, and I'm going to share those things with you now. The questions may look different, but inspectors will want to find out these things. They'll want to find out to what extent the curriculum endpoints, so at the end of Key Stage 3 or 2 or 1, how clear are they? How clear are leaders about what they want children to learn in this music curriculum? And you may remember from previous sessions that I've done, one of the things that our research says is that where leaders in music have got a really clear conception of what they want children to learn, what they want them to be able to do, be able to hear, be able to play, they're likely to have a more successful curriculum. Children are likely to learn more. So we'll want to find out to what extent the endpoints, what you want children to learn in music, are clear. We'll want to find out about how you break the subject content down into little chunks, little smaller steps, and how you put those in an order to build towards an endpoint. And the last presentation I gave to you, I talked in a school, I gave an example of children learning the ukulele and how the school had thought about the order, the little bits that children had to learn as they were going along, that Jenga tower idea, little building blocks. We'll want to talk to you about that. So a question might be something like, oh, I noticed that in your curriculum, you've said to me by the end, you want your children to become really competent singers to sing in 2 parts. Can you show me, help me understand? How do you go about doing that through your curriculum? Talk to me about the steps that children have to learn to get to that point. We'll also in that subject want to talk about the rigor of subject-specific planning, where appropriate. So in music, that's about making sure that the music that's being taught is rigorous, that it's appropriate, that it matches the demands of the national curriculum. And finally, we will be interested to know how your curriculum is taught to perhaps your most vulnerable pupils, including those with SEND. So in summary, this discussion with subject leaders will want to understand how your curriculum is designed and why you've made the choices about the content that you have, why you've put things in the order that you have to build that knowledge and those skills, and to find out how you teach that so that pupils remember. And remember, go back to it. Want children to become more musical. How do you go about it to ensure that children do become more musical? We are not trying to catch people out. We really want to work with you and to understand the curriculum in your school. What is it you want your children to learn by the time they finish your curriculum is a really key question. What is it that you want them to know, be able to do and understand? So that's that discussion, and those are the sorts of things that we will explore with you in that curriculum discussion. Once we've done that, ideally, as I've said, that goes first, we pick up these other themes, and we're next going to look at what happens during lesson visits. Next slide, please, Rosie. Thank you. So as I've said, we do not select random lessons and work. They are connected. So I'll have had a discussion with you and you'll have said, Chris, today, year 8, they're learning about the blues. As part of this work, they're learning to play the blues scale, because later on in the term, they're going to start improvising using the blues scale. We've already taught them the 12-bar blues. They can all play that now using single-fingered chords. Today, we introduce the blues scale. And to start with, we're just going to teach them in this lesson to get that under their fingers so that before they improvise, they've got that really secure. That's what you're going to see in Year 8 today. And that's why we're doing it in that order. Okay, we may go and visit that lesson to see that in action. Really helpful. Have children secured what's gone before? In this case, have they got those single-fingered chords accurately? Are they having enough practice? Are they doing what's set out in the curriculum? So we'll visit that lesson. We'll visit several lessons in music in different year groups of classes, if they're on at that time, of course. We will pay particular attention to how pupils with SEND are being supported in that classroom. And you or senior leaders invited to join us that. And as I've said, we will not be evaluating individual teachers or their teachers. So the lesson visits that we carry out during a deep dive are not to judge teaching. They're called lesson visits for a reason. We're visiting to see the curriculum in action. We are not going to do lesson observations, which is about judgment of teachers. That's not their purpose. And we want to see is what's being learned. Are teachers delivering the curriculum as you want them to, as you've said they would be? Do teachers have adequate knowledge in that to be able to teach that subject and that curriculum? And do they understand how to best teach the content so that pupils can remember it? Now, while we're visiting those lessons, a little side point, because of inspection being a judgment, not just of the quality of education, but behaviour and personal development, inspectors will also be gathering evidence about pupils' attitudes to their learning, their relationships in school between pupils and staff. They might also be looking at some of the personal development, the wider opportunities that children have. That's a bit of an aside, but inspectors do gather that as they visit lessons as well. And then we move on to work scrutiny and pupil discussions, which is our next slide. Thank you. So just on this with work scrutiny, I've spoken before, but for those people who haven't heard me, I'll make it really, hopefully really clear. I said at the start of the presentation, we don't have a view on whether schools should use workbooks, whether schools should make recordings, whether schools should have video recordings of pupils' work. We don't have a view on that. Work scrutiny in music, I mean, if you take history, when we talk about work scrutiny, you can imagine in a deep dive that the history inspector would go off, would have said to the teacher as part of the lesson visits, oh, I'd like to see those 3 children's books because it's connected. They'd take those 3 books and then perhaps with the head of history sit down with those 3 books and they could say, right, let's have a look at the books. Okay, these books tell us what children learned previously, what they went on to, what came next. There's a sort of written documentation or summary of what's happened. It's very, very unlikely that that kind of books are going to exist in music. So it may be that the work scrutiny activities don't happen, that there is no work scrutiny, and that's fine in music. Increasingly, some schools are saying, Chris, is it helpful for us to have recordings, video recordings or audio recordings of children's work or the class's performances for us to show inspectors? And my answer to that is it useful for you? Not is it useful for us, but actually if taking recordings of children's work and video recordings is really helpful to you in terms of your assessment, telling you something about the standards children achieve, and you do that work as part of your ongoing assessment of children, then by all means share it with us if you think it would be helpful. So an example a couple of weeks ago, I'm not saying Ofsted says you should do this, but a school said, Chris, we keep videos at the end of every term when children have done their work. And this particular primary school, they were working on the children becoming better singers as they move through the curriculum. That was a big part of their curriculum. And they said, Chris, we've got some recordings if you'd be interested at children at the end of year 2. We've got the same class at the end of year 3. They're now in year 4. Can we show you those? Because we think they really show how our children are getting better at singing. And of course, yeah, that'd be really interesting to look at. Thank you. We'd want to see that information if you have it. The school weren't collecting that information for Ofsted. They were collecting that information because actually it was part of what they normally did. They felt it was helpful to take those recordings to form their own assessment. But that can be helpful to show to people the kind of musical progress that children are making, helpful for yourselves as leaders in your departments. So the typical work scrutiny of the workbooks may look very different, or it may not happen in music if that doesn't exist, and that's fine. And then pupils' discussions. This is an interesting one because we'll talk to some pupils from lessons and we'll want to talk to them about their learning to see whether they are learning the music curriculum. And I want to reassure you a little bit here. I've spoken about this in the past. This is not a pub quiz. So we don't put children into a room and say to them, when was Mozart born? Can you tell me how many symphonies did Beethoven write? We're there to see whether children are learning your music curriculum. And if your music curriculum is built around, for example, a big part of it is about children becoming better, performing more expressively on the keyboard, we'd want to talk to them about the kind of keyboard pieces they've been playing and how they've been getting better and what things they've been doing that were harder than before. We'd want to try and triangulate whether they're learning your curriculum in your school. It's not a random set of questions to check a random set of knowledge. It's about whether your curriculum is being learned. And for example, in the school I talked about there, where the children were singing, and the whole point of the curriculum in this school was they were going to be better singers, and by the end of year 6, really competent at singing in parts. I talked to the children about some of the songs that they were singing and how the songs were different from the songs they sang last year. And it was really interesting. The children talked, it's harder because I have to sing a different tune to my friend, and we're starting to do that. And they were able, it was clear from their conversation that they were incrementally becoming better performers. So that's the point of the pupil discussions. Are they learning the curriculum as set out in your school? It's not a pub quiz. Next slide, please. Thank you, Rosie. And then finally, discussions with staff. Now, discussions with staff will be the staff of the lessons that we visited in. And of course, in a very small department, there may only be one teacher. It may be that the head of department, we've already had that conversation. So we wouldn't have an unnecessary discussion with that teacher again. We would have had that. It would make sense. No hard and fast rules, but it would have made sense to have that conversation earlier. But if it's a department where there's 2 or 3 teachers and we've seen them teach as part of our lesson visits, we will talk to them. And equally in a primary school, if music's being delivered by a number of teachers across the school, if we see them teach, we'll want to talk to them. And what do we want to find out from them? This joining this curriculum back up again. Well, we'd want to find out about how well they understand the school's curriculum, how well they understand why the children are doing this at this particular point, and why they need to learn these things. Why is it important that they're learning this? What happens next? But testing out really whether the staff really understand how the school curriculum in your school works. We'll be interested to know what training and support they've had to deliver the content in the school well. And again, within a primary context, it may be that teachers, probably very likely, are not going to be music specialists. So we'd be interested to know what support, what training have you got that's helping you to deliver that content? What are leaders doing to support you in that? We'll also in those discussions want to talk to you about workload, including whether assessment and assessment practices create any unnecessary burdens. I've spoken in the past about work scrutiny. You'll notice I didn't mention this about some staff having to record verbal oral feedback, which creates huge amounts of work for teachers. Well, if we find that's happening and staff tell us that, that will be something we would want to raise with leaders, because that's not a good use of assessment. And secondly, photographs. Taking photographs of children taking part in musical activities. This can be commonplace in a primary school. Now, there may be a reason that a school does that because they want to check the curriculum's being covered. Okay, but we don't expect to see photographic evidence because it doesn't tell us anything about the musical quality, the sound the music children are making. And again, that can place a huge burden on staff having to take photographs all the time rather than actually teaching the children. So it's those sort of things that we'll want to discuss with you there to make sure that there aren't any unnecessary burdens that are getting in the way of teaching music and your own workload. And then in that discussion, we will also touch on safeguarding and pupils' behaviour. So that brings me towards the end of my presentation where I'll take some questions, but I just want to summarise for you really. If we go on to the next slide, please, Rosie. Thank you for doing a marvellous job there for moving. It was quite challenging having to do that on two screens because I've got my script in front of me, but I really appreciate that. Thank you, Rosie. So in summary, it's a joined up discussion. If you're taking anything away from this presentation, when you set out your curriculum in your discussion, help us understand what is it you want children to learn in your school? In order to learn those endpoints, what are the building blocks along the way? Why have you put them in that order? And then the rest of the deep dive activities, we're going out there to see the curriculum in action. Is what you intend? Is it working? Are children learning the curriculum? Have staff got enough knowledge to be able to deliver that? And are children's outcomes, are they becoming better at music as a result of your curriculum? So thank you very much for listening.